Well, welcome to this Thursday's edition of our academic grand round for the Department of Psychiatry. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our special speaker, Teresa Reed, who is the Dean of the University of Louisville School of Music. I'm Robert Caudell, I'm the Director of Residency Training here. Dr. Dean has been with the university since 2019. She received her Ph.D. in music theory, music history, and literature and African American studies from Indiana University. She was on the faculty at the University of Tulsa for 25 years before coming here. She's written a very meaningful book. I hope many of you have had a chance to read that, and I hope many more of you will if you haven't. My quick thoughts on it is it's a powerful book that seeks to unite rather than divide. And in these times, that's a very valuable feature. It's not coincidental, I think, that a musician wrote a book such as this. Trying to play together well is always one of our goals in that regard. Without further ado and without further delay, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Reed. And thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you to all my colleagues in the psychiatry area. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'd like to ask Robert's help, if you would, to put up the very first slide. And it's an image that I'd like to begin with as I sort of work through the reason that I wrote the book, You're Likely Not a Racist, Answers for Curious White People. So this image is one that I'd like to sort of plant in your thinking. And I'd like to couple that with a question. You don't have to literally answer it, but it's a question about what we can do today with discovering our ancestry. I know that there is Ancestry.com does a DNA test that you can get. I think 23andMe has something like that. So if you've ever done a DNA test, sort of look at where you came from, it's likely in some of those cases that we can find out things that are different than what our family history reported. And that was the case for me. And I want to go back to this image at the end and connect that observation to something that has to do with race and the way we think about race in this country, which is often in terms that ignore many of the nuances and subtleties that are a part of our racial reality. So I'd like to talk now. Thank you very much, Robert. I'd like to talk now a little bit about my book, You're Likely Not a Racist, Answers for Curious White People. It's the fourth book that I've written, and it has nothing to do with my academic specialty as a musician, but has everything to do with some very personal interests that I have in, quite frankly, and perhaps simplistically, making the world a better place as much as I can. So what motivated me to write this book goes back really perhaps to 1990. I'll start there. And if there are those among you who have heard this story before, I'm going to apologize for my repetition, but it's really one that I can't share often enough because it really underscores what brings me to this conversation with you today. So 1990. I'm living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I am a graduate student at the University of Tulsa, and we have a gospel choir that meets every Saturday at noon in Tyrrell Hall. And that gospel choir, student choir, is directed by a local minister whose name is Joey Crutcher. And Joey Crutcher is a treasure in the community, particularly in the Black church community. He's a local minister, part of a very talented musical family. And out of the goodness of his heart, Joey comes and meets with us students every Saturday at noon to do these choir rehearsals. And over the years, Joey became someone who was very, very dear to many of us in the community. Joey, in fact, was the musician at my wedding in 1996 and was someone that many of us encountered typically around music or church activities in the years that followed. So that's 1990-ish. Fast forward to September 2016. And it was in September 2016 that I'm watching the news And there is a report in Tulsa of a young African-American man who had been shot and killed. And the report around that incident was that this man was stalled in the middle of the road in a North Tulsa neighborhood. He is a rather large African-American man. He is soon approached by law officers. Someone called the police. Apparently, he was deemed to be suspicious. And the recording of the conversation of the officers who came to the scene captures one of the officers saying, "This looks like a bad dude." Within literally seconds of that statement, that young man is gunned down. And he's gunned down as his hands are in the air and his back is to the officers who are approaching him as he stands beside his stalled car. That young man was Terrence Crutcher, who was the son of my friend, Joey Crutcher. So 2016 was a time of great tension in the city of Tulsa. And it was unfortunately a part of a pattern that seemed to be emerging nationally around the killings of African-American, primarily men who were unarmed in similar situations. So that occurred in 2016. Fast forward to 2020. By this time, I'm living in Louisville. And spring 2020, as you might recall, was not only the time of the emergence of COVID, but that was coupled with a lot of unrest in the country and here in the city of Louisville, as the city comes to terms with the killing of Breonna Taylor, which is in close chronological proximity to the killing of Ahmaud Arbery and the killing of George Floyd. And there are these national stories of African-American people being gunned down for having committed no crime or done anything other than being deemed to be suspicious. And so spring 2020, the city of Louisville is on edge. The campus here of U of L is on edge. And at that time, President Neely Bendapudi reaches out to the administration, all of the deans at the on the campus, and suggests that we each write to our units a message of affirming our values and the importance of diversity and equity and inclusion and justice. And the president's office gives to all of the deans a collection of talking points to make that message come across with the institutional stamp of approval. So I sit down to write my letter to the School of Music as the dean to reinforce and affirm these values of diversity and equity, inclusion and justice, and to acknowledge the angst and the tension and the pain that many of our students and our citizens are feeling. But I cannot use the talking points that are provided to me, because what is triggered by that experience for me is a return to 2016, when the son of my friend, Joey Crutcher, Terrence Crutcher, was killed, and all of the unresolved feelings that I dealt with around that incident. So let's go back then to Terrence Crutcher's situation. 2016, September 16th, 2016, Joey Crutcher loses his son, Terrence Crutcher, and that incident is national news. There is a widely disseminated photograph of Terrence Crutcher standing beside his stalled car, hands in the air, and moments later, he's gunned down. It was in May of 2017 that the officer who pulled the trigger was brought to trial. So keep in mind, in the city of Tulsa, there had been quite a legacy of racial unrest, going back to certainly the 1921 race massacre. And that was a shadow over the city. The killing of Terrence Crutcher in 2016 was salt to the wound. And the city, during that period between the murder of Terrence Crutcher and the trial of Betty Shelby, the city is absolutely on edge. And there are these two narratives developing around the death of Terrence Crutcher that are as extremely opposite, as extremely polarized as you can imagine. On the one hand, there are African-American people who are heartbroken and grief-stricken at the death of Terrence Crutcher, who is someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother, someone's community member, a member of a family that was loved and cherished in the Black community. On the other hand, there is this narrative of Terrence Crutcher's death as a villain taken off the street, someone who got what he deserved, and someone who with absolutely no evidence of wrongdoing at all, should have been killed. And the officer who pulled the trigger, her name was Betty Shelby, was celebrated as a hero. So those two narratives are going on at the same time. On May 17th, 2017, the verdict is to be read. And I remember being at a local shopping mall and wanting to hear the verdict and not wanting to hear the verdict at the same time, feeling in one way that this incident was captured on camera for pretty much the world to see, and who could argue with that? And yet it was around slightly after lunchtime that the news broke that Betty Shelby, the officer who pulled the trigger, was acquitted for that murder. Almost simultaneously, you could hear eruptions of reaction to that. On the one hand, there were African-American people who are largely devastated at this news. At the very same time, there is great celebration that Betty Shelby, the hero who took a bad guy off the street, was got the justice that she deserved. So these narratives are diametrically opposed to each other. And I get the news and I am heartbroken. I'm stunned. I'm almost paralyzed. And I'm in the mall as my phone is blowing up. You're in a music school, so if you hear music while I'm talking, just consider it background noise. There's nothing I can do about that. My students are practicing as they should. So I'm in the mall and I'm crying at the news that Betty Shelby has been acquitted. And for some reason, I feel the compulsion to reach out to a friend of mine. And the friend that I reach out to is a white friend of mine, someone that I'd known for about 20 years by that point. She and I were great buddies. We had worked out together on a regular basis, had gone to lunch together, had shared many experiences together. We were graduate students together. We had a long history together. But my white friend, the one thing that we had never discussed in over 20 years of knowing each other, we had never talked about race. It simply never came up. We never addressed any reality around the fact that she was white and I was Black. We just got along really well, like super good friends that we were. And at that moment, feeling the pain and the disappointment of the Betty Shelby verdict, I felt compelled to reach out to my friend. And I think part of that compulsion was my need to know, which side of the camp she was on. I needed to know whether she too felt like Terrence Crutcher got what he deserved, or whether there was any way for her to understand, as my good friend, that this was a devastating experience for me and for many African-American people who had seen this happen over and over again, probably in recent times. Trayvon Martin, that whole situation with Trayvon Martin going to a 7-Eleven in his own neighborhood, is killed by a wannabe cop who considers him suspicious, and Philando Castile, who is gunned down in front of his girlfriend, reaching for his license. And these incidents, seemingly repetitive incidents, layered one on top of the other, created a really deep wound. So I reached out to my friend, and I'm teary-eyed. I take out my phone and I send her a text, a simple text. I simply said to her, "I am not well." And I hit send and I waited for her to respond. And I had no idea how she would respond because we'd never talked about race before. And I didn't even know if she would have a clue as to what I was even talking about. Within moments, she responded. And here's what gave me hope. I only had to say, I am not well, in order for her to understand exactly what I was talking about. She didn't have to be Black. She didn't have to be African American. We didn't have to have a history of deep discussions about race in order for her to get it. And the fact that she got it, the fact that she understood exactly what I was saying, and that she was able to empathize in that moment and to say to me the words that I needed to hear and to affirm our friendship, that is the reason. That is the reason that I was able to emerge from the disappointment of that verdict and still have hope that there are good people and that there is the possibility that people can come to a place of understanding, even if the experience is not necessarily shared. There are good people with good hearts that have the capacity to understand what it feels like to live in a country where the color of your skin can literally get you killed. So I started writing You're Likely Not a Racist during the first Obama administration because I was convinced that there must be a deeper reason that it was possible for these two perspectives to coexist and still be so incredibly opposite one from the other. And that deeper reason had to do with my conviction that it wasn't just racism. It was ignorance. The fact that there could be such simultaneous celebration and heartbreak meant, in my mind, that there's a part of the conversation that's not being addressed. There is the assumption when there is a deficiency in education, the assumption is that people of color are disadvantaged when it comes to education. And there is some truth to that because of systemic inequity in the institutional structure of education. Yes, that's true. However, there's another educational deficiency that people almost never talk about. And that is the fact that white people, by virtue of the detachment that white people get to enjoy from issues of race, white people simply don't know many things. And because of a lack of knowing, there are assumptions that drive beliefs and value systems and truths that are really at conflict with a reality that they don't necessarily engage with. The analogy would be that if you don't live in the water, then you don't have the experience of being a fish and you don't have those concerns. And so I wanted to write a book that made it safe for white people to address their knowledge gaps without being punished for what they don't know. Robert, if you would be willing to pull up then the second slide, I'd like to talk about a pattern, a common pattern that happens whenever there is an attempt to honestly address issues of race or ignorance around race. And this pattern is one that is repeated over and over and over and over again. So there is typically in some way the exposure of a knowledge gap. Yeah. And that knowledge gap is one that is really nobody's fault in particular. You simply can't know what you don't know. When that knowledge gap is exposed, very often it becomes a flashpoint. And one of the reasons for that is that for African American people, there is a centuries-old history of trauma that is sometimes visible, sometimes not. That flashpoint often leads to an outcry, and that outcry produces a consequence. And that consequence is often one that causes white people to retreat and abandon and walk away from their curiosity altogether because they were accused at some point of being a racist for having the curiosity in the first place. So, textbook example of this, and I talk about this in the book, is Dr. Laura Schlesinger. She was a syndicated radio talk show host who in 2010, during the first Obama administration, received a call from the Black wife of in a interracial marriage. And Dr. Laura's show was to give advice and to answer people who had various dilemmas. So the caller calls Dr. Laura and says, Dr. Laura, I'm a Black woman, I'm married to a white guy, and here's my dilemma. His friends make racist jokes. What do I do? Dr. Laura then explodes and basically tells the caller that, if you're not tough enough to be in an interracial marriage, then you shouldn't be in one. You should grow a thick skin. And by the way, why are you Black people so sensitive? She goes on then to say, why is it that Black people can say the N-word all the time on HBO and Comic View, but that if I, as a white person, use the N-word, then I lose my job and I am immediately condemned. Why is that? And then Dr. Laura, to make her point even more vivid, says the N-word a bunch of times in rapid succession for her nationally syndicated radio audience to hear. Well, that led to a flashpoint and an outcry. And the consequence was that within days, Dr. Laura lost sponsorship. She was forced to abandon her show and walk away. And I am not sure whether Dr. Laura ever returned to her question, and that is the tragedy. The tragedy here is not that Dr. Laura used the N-word on the radio for millions of people to hear. That was hurtful, but that's not the real tragedy. The real tragedy is that Dr. Laura had a legitimate question, and she had no safe way to answer it. And because of this paradigm of knowledge gap leading to flashpoint and outcry and consequence, the tendency to retreat and abandon is very human. We all want to protect ourselves. So I imagine a different and better paradigm. If you would, Robert, go to the next slide, in which we have a productive paradigm when it comes to addressing issues of race, where retreat and abandon is not the automatic response. So I imagine that I have an opportunity to address Dr. Laura's knowledge gap, because after all, she had a legitimate question. And her legitimate question was this: why do Black people use the N-word with no problem, but white people who use it suffer great consequence? That's a logical question. That's a legitimate question. And it's a question that deserves an answer and that has an answer. In fact, it's one of the chapters in the book is that exactly why do I not get away with using the N-word? So I imagine creating for Dr. Laura a safe space in which we have a conversation as peers, and I can answer her question without condemning her for not knowing. And I would explain to her that the reason that that word is problematic for white people to use is because its meaning is connected to the one who utters it, which is very unusual in our use of language. Typically, there's some etymological reason for why things mean what they do. In the case of the N-word, its meaning really comes from the person who utters it. And I would explain that to her, not in an accusatory way or in a way that would demean her, but in a way that meets her at the point of her curiosity. It answers her curiosity in a way that satisfies her need to know and allows her to keep her dignity. And that's the part of the conversation about race that I felt was missing. And so when we comply with this dysfunctional paradigm of discussing race, we simply perpetuate ignorance. That's all we do. We don't move the needle. If we can find a way to safely invite white people or any people to expose their knowledge gaps about race, and we can retain space for the fact that there might be a flashpoint, because there is a lot of trauma there. But instead of immediately jumping to outcry, if we stop and we risk and we teach and we learn, then the outcome would be clarity and understanding. And that would lead to empathy, trust, and friendship. And that knowledge gap, while it might persist, would shrink over time. And that's my very simplistic theory on how we can move the needle on race relations in this country and move forward in a positive way that affirms the basic goodness of people. I think when we rush to the accusation of racism, we perpetuate this cycle, assuming that people somehow magically know through osmosis or some other, process that's irrational, that people know without learning. And none of us can do that. So some of the topics that are covered in the book include that one. Why the N-word has the life that it does. I talk about, I'm not going to repeat all of the chapters in the book because they're there, but a lot of white people want to know why Black people are so angry. They have a reaction, perhaps, to something in the news that becomes the subject of protest, but may not understand the full context of that. So I talk about that. There are honest questions that white people have, perhaps, about why Black neighborhoods in many urban centers look the way that they do. I have answers for that. I have answers that I'm offering, not as the authority necessarily on race relations. I don't put myself forward as being that, but I believe that my experiences are typical and that I can offer some insights that put a different frame, perhaps, around some of the questions that deserve to be addressed. So I was sharing with colleagues last night at a lovely dinner that I recently went to a plantation in Bradesville, South Carolina, where the Black and white descendants of a plantation have found each other. And they have also affirmed through DNA testing that they are blood related. And now they're going through the process of building family relationships with each other, even though they come from very different experiences. And I think that's a beautiful way to sort of reckon with history and also explore possibility, and really look at what happens when we assume people to be basically good. Simplistic perhaps, but it's a core belief that I have. If you would go back, Robert, to the very first slide, I want to go back to that image and talk a little bit about DNA testing and an experience that I had. These are my ancestors, and this is a photograph of my great grandparents. They're seated in the center, and they are celebrating in this photograph their 50th wedding anniversary in Arkansas, St. Francis County, Arkansas. The two of them were married in 1894, and this 50th wedding anniversary celebration includes their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And one of those young people in the picture is my grandmother. My grandmother and my great-grandmother are pictured here. Anyway, here's the part about the DNA. So I took one of those Ancestry.com DNA tests, and the family folklore had been for years and years that we had Native American heritage. And that's not uncommon among African American people. There are lots of family bonds between people of color, African Americans and Native Americans, that developed in from the colonial period and persisted for centuries after that. So the idea that we were Native Americans somehow as part of our heritage was not surprising or unusual. So I took this DNA test, though, and to my shock and surprise, my results came back with not one drop of Native American ancestry. And turns out that the story that was told to us for many years about being Native American was actually false. Other siblings tested and found similar results. And we learned, long story short, that story was probably fabricated to hide another one. And the other story is that the woman seated in the center of this photo, my great-great-grandmother, was not Native American. She was white. And this was the interracial marriage between an African American and a white woman in 1894. Learning more, in the South, by the way, learning more about this history. One of the people in my family who does the bulk of the genealogical study on that side talked about what it took for Polly Moore to marry Joseph Whitaker in 1894. She had to petition for permission to get married to him, and the requirement for her was that she had to live with his family for 1 year before she would be permitted to legally marry him, which she did. They then got married, interracial couple in the South in 1894. They had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and so forth and so on. So here's my point. Why don't we underscore more of these stories? In the book, I talk about another interracial relationship on my mother's side. This is not that unusual, but what we get most of in our discourse on race in this country, what we get most of is how we're different and how we don't get along and how we can't possibly find common ground. We get most of that, but there are these other stories, these other realities, these other family bonds that prove that there is more nuance to this than we give it credit for. So I believe at this point, I've said most of what I'd like to say, and I'm going to hand it back over to Robert for any questions.
So if you want to identify with a raised hand, we can call on you that way. Or if you prefer to enter your questions into the Q&A function of Zoom, I will try to moderate that. So let me see who's our attendee list that might have an interest in speaking. And I'm going to start bringing in some of the faculty and senior residents as well. So, but I'm going to, or Saber, can you do that? Can you bring in faculty members to the as panelists and bring in the chiefs perhaps? Well, we'll go from there and see how we go. I'll start bringing in some faculty though.
I'm seeing some names that I know. Hello. Hi, Tracy.
Hello, Teresa. The host has asked me to speak. I just got a message and I'm very happy to speak and very happy to say hello to you, Teresa. And thank you for your presentation and for doing this for us today. And it just makes so much sense what you have said. I only, I hope that the message can be more widely disseminated. And I found myself thinking back years when when I was first in college, I played basketball and I had African-American roommates and they used the N-word all the time, calling me repeatedly the N-word. And, which I actually took as, hey, I'm a part of the group.
That you're exactly right. Tracy, that was used in that context. That was a term of endearment.
Well, it felt like it at the time. We were just sitting around kind of BSing and, all of that. And I will tell you that I used that same word back to them. Maybe I needed to be a little more aware, but as a 18, 19, etc. year old person, I wanted to be part of that too. And I guess your explanation makes sense to me about why that word really has a different meaning depending on who's saying it and on the identity of the individual. And I guess I'm just thinking if we can show each other more grace and not leap to conclusions and take into account psychosocial development and past learning and intent, that could go so far in improving race relations in this country, which are, I'm just jabbering on here a little bit, but I'm just remember thinking back then, this was in the 70s, that we're on a positive trend, because this was in California, and I know still good friends of mine, actually, these two people in particular. One came out of the South. I mean, his his family came out of the South, and to escape, what he had done is gone from their family had moved from the South to the North, and then from the North to the West to provide more opportunity for their kids, including my friend, who took full advantage of that and now is worth $50+ million. And if you were to go to any mini mart and look at those little monster refrigerators, his company makes those now.
Wow.
So, we've managed to stay friends, and but even now though, when we talk, there's, at least I feel that I've got to be a little more careful maybe with him as we get to, and maybe he with me as we talk about race relations. I don't know. I just feel it's kind of sad that sometimes we feel that we cannot be as open as we would like. And let me wrap this up. I have many Black psychotherapy patients, and I think it's important to discuss with one's patients, when you're of different ethnicities, what they think and feel about that. And I did have such a conversation very, very recently with one Black client who I think had never raised it themselves, and I think appreciated that I had taken the initiative to raise it. And the responses that I have received when I raise this are always surprising. They're very rarely, the sort of the stereotype that we might expect. I mean, one of the more memorable was a patient who said, "Oh, I would never see a Black man in therapy. I would never have a Black man as a therapist. Black men have treated me like fill in the blank my entire life. I want a white therapist." But that is not the stereotype. So that's something that I have, asking that question and being willing to explore that in the context of our professional work is to initiate the discussion. If the patient does not initiate it, is important. Any comment you've got on that, I would value highly, Brand.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It takes a lot of courage to address these topics that are delicate and that are potentially triggering. It takes a lot of courage to do that. But I think that unless we are willing to be courageous and first get to the table and then stay at the table and work through whatever our awkwardness might be, whatever our misgivings or whatever our feelings of clumsiness are, unless we're willing to do that, then I think we'll continue to cycle around the same misunderstandings over and over again. So I applaud all efforts at being authentic and trusting that some level of authenticity will be offered in return.
We have a number of faculty that have joined the panelist side, and so feel free to speak up with questions. We do have one that came in from the audience asking, what are your thoughts on critical race theory? What are the useful parts and what parts just feed into the division?
I will be very honest and tell you, I don't really know what critical race theory is. That comes up again and again and again. And I have yet to see a clear definition of critical race theory that satisfies my curiosity about, where that label comes from. All I know is that there's history. There's history. And I think if you get several members of a family together in a room and you ask different members of the family their version of a story, they're each probably going to give you a different version. And the version of the story that prevails might come from the person with the loudest voice. That's just human nature. So the fact that there can be multiple versions of a story is not unusual at all. We know that there has been a prevalent, generally speaking, version of American history that is told from the perspective, traditionally has been told from the perspective of those who have had both power and literacy. We have to recognize that for quite a long time, literacy was not accessible to many segments of the population, not just in accordance with race, but in accordance with socioeconomic status. There were many people who did not have access to literacy who were white, and because they didn't have the money or the means to have access to literacy. So that perspective was missing. The perspective of women was largely missing in circles where women were not deemed to be worthy of being educated. So there are multiple tellings and perspectives possible when addressing the story of our history as Americans. And there are perspectives that have been more salient than others. What I see labeled often as critical race theory is fuzzy in my mind, because sometimes I'm not entirely sure about why a perspective that brings to bear the experiences of people of color deserve to have a label. So I don't know if my answer satisfies what you're looking for, but the short response I can give is I don't really know what critical race theory is.
I think I understand what it is. I think critical race theory is white people in America saying, I like white supremacy, and I don't know what critical race theory is, but I don't want it. And by the way, thank you for addressing our group back in the book club that you met with one time back in Shawnee Library. And by the way, for the group that's here, Dr. and Mrs. Menshadi were at that group, and so were Dr. and Mrs. Kuhn. But anyway, thank you for coming again. But I think that the critical race is really a euphemism for what I don't like it, whatever it is.
I think Dr. Oliva had a question or point to make.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Reed, for doing this talk and this discussion. I think it's open. It's good to have an open discussion like this. I'm one of the fourth-year residents. I think there's kind of a macro and micro perspective. I take when I was reading your book and I was listening to your talk. It's it seems like whenever these flashpoints happen, from my perspective, whenever these things occur, where there's a police shooting, a protest or riot, it seems like in the macro sense, there's no conversation on why this is happening.
Exactly.
Right? And it seems that some parts of the media either want to talk about what to do to solve the problem, whatever the problem is, or some parts want to just vilify what's going on. Say there's a protest, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. People are either talking about what we need to do to correct the police departments, or to how the protests are bad or amoral or like terrorists, and all this hyperbole gets blown up. And that just shuts off the discussion, because like no one's talking to each other. There's actually no discussion what happened. We don't understand the history of what's been going on. We don't have a discussion on why these things are happening, why there's shootings, why civic members of community feel neglected and discriminated against. I think that's on the macro sense, but then in the micro sense, I feel like because as a white Hispanic man, I feel like race has become so polarized in so many ways that I even feel uncomfortable talking about it, even though I agree, and I think I understood most of what you said in your book. I think I had a good previous sense of it. I feel almost uncomfortable talking about it with people just because it feels so polarized. I'm not sure that's really a question, but it's kind of a comment that was in my head.
Sure. Yeah, I think part of our culture, and some of this just relates to technology, part of our culture relies upon quick explanations. So I don't know how many people on this call remember the world before Google. Seems like a long time ago, but there was a time when you did not have instant information at your fingertips. And our reality now is that we have literally instant information at our fingertips. It's largely uncurated. It comes to us however we try to access it. We can Google something and find a Wikipedia answer for it within seconds. Now, whether that's vetted and whether that's proven to be a solid answer and a sound and well-researched answer, we don't really typically take the time to do all of that. We just want something that will quick fix, satisfy our curiosity. And we have the capacity to access quick fix information at any moment, in any part of the day, in any part of the world. What that creates for us, I think, as a culture is the assumption that knowledge is acquired that easily, when in fact, you can acquire lots of tidbits that easily, but you cannot acquire deep understanding and context that easily. It takes time and intentionality to understand the context of a situation that may emerge in one way in 2022, but have roots that go back to the 17th century. And that's not a conversation that most of us make the time or even understand requires the time to have. And so people react to the leaves and the trunk and the branches and have no idea how deep the roots go. We typically don't do that. So our culture kind of it facilitates an expectation that if something is going to be understood, it can be understood in 2 minutes or less. I mean, just think about how impatient we get when we're navigating from one web page to another, and it takes a full 7 seconds that we get impatient. We think, why don't I get this information that quickly? Well, I think recognizing that we have this we have this built-in unrealistic expectation for instant understanding, recognizing that positions us to make the choice to dig deeper and invest the time that it takes to really understanding that anytime you see a protest, or anytime you see that a woman who is in the park with her dog calling the police on a bird watcher because he's African American, anytime you see that, that's not that isolated incident. That is the latest manifestation of something that has roots that go way, way, way back. And until we understand that, and understand that it takes time to understand that, then I think we will repeat a lot of the same misunderstanding.
Thank you, Dr. Oliva. We have a former program coordinator of our department on the call, Cherie Bingham, and I'm going to open it for her.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Reed, for being willing to address this topic and to write a book and to really understand and try to make better a really complicated situation. So as soon as I can, I'll get a copy of your book. But my question is, I'm not sure if you're involved with any of the anti-racism committees and things that are going on as far as institutionally, but how can we create these safe spaces to have these honest conversations and answer these questions?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes. Before President Bendapudi left, I was one of many faculty members and members of the staff and administration who were brought together to participate in CARA, the Cardinal Anti-Racism Agenda. And I'm sure that many of you on this call probably have heard about that. That work was intensive, and it involved lots of meetings and gathering lots of data and doing surveys and sort of, checking the pulse of the way people at U of L perceived race and the needs around anti-racism. So yes, I was involved in that. There was, of course, the seismic shift in our administration when President Bendapudi and Michael Wade Smith, who was her chief of staff, who was part of coordinating all of that, when they left, there were lots of questions around what was going to happen to CARA. Lee Gill is the new executive on campus who's in charge of diversity initiatives, and he is aware that work was started, and I think that he's very invested and seeing how that work can move forward. One of the things that I learned as a member of the committee, the faculty committee on CARA, and there were several committees. One of the things that I learned about U of L is that U of L's complexity sometimes outpaces the ability of people to articulate in a coordinated way kind of what's going on here. So you have lots of very interesting and good initiatives happening around anti-racism, here at U of L, but there are lots of isolated, very siloed pockets, and very often the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. I don't think that's anybody's fault. I think that's just a part of the U of L culture, where you have a lot of activity, you have lots of initiatives, you have lots of good intent that come out in lots of different projects that might happen at the department level or the office level. And, that became apparent to me when I was, privy to the survey results around CARA. But how you coordinate all of that under a common umbrella is a pretty heavy lift. But I think that Lee Gill is very interested in moving the needle on that. I think creating safe spaces is something, though, that each one of us can do in our individual lives. And that's something that can happen with or without an institution necessarily. If I am willing to listen, when I understand that sometimes white people have curiosities and questions that they may not necessarily articulate as a question in the way that we might be used to hearing. If I'm open to that, and if someone says something that might at first blush seems racist, if I'm willing to pause and probe for the question in that and recognize that this person wants to be a good person. They also are a person who might have curiosity. They might have knowledge gaps that they don't know how to fill. If I'm willing to take the risk to serve as a source of information, a non-judgmental source of information for that person, then I may not be in charge of an office or a project or a major institutional initiative around anti-racism. But what I am doing in my own circle and in my own life is I am creating a space. I have the power to create a space for that person that may not exist anywhere else. So on one hand, I think institutional efforts are important and they are good, but I think probably equally important are the ways that we operate in our own circles and the ways that we wield the influence of compassion in our own circles where we work and live.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm grateful to have you on campus as a resource and a reference. And if I can think of any way to pull you in on our side of campus over here in graduate medical education or the health sciences campus, I will do that. So expect to hear from me or someone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Dr. Rabbani has a question or comment.
Hello, Dr. Reed, and thank you very much for this talk. I have a comment and also a question. My comment is that to address the racism and this race issue, it should be a broad thing. One of them that I am seeing it is lacking in the United States is that there should be a systematic education, about this issue. Who are Blacks? From the elementary school going up, that trace of they think that Blacks are different than whites, it would go away. They would know the reality. I don't see that happening. That is one thing that can help, I think, racism. The other thing is that, of course, I'm seeing it more through movies, books, history books. For example, when I said systematic education in the elementary school by stories, talking about, a family, a Black family, or this and that, to make them understand them and to make them empathic from childhood. The other thing is that through the religious, kind of the church, they should help it. This is something that the sooner to be addressed is the better for the society. It is not good for white. It is not good for Black population. Why it should be that difference? I am my religion. I am a Baha'i, and in our church, as you are calling a church, in our religion, there are a lots of emphasis on elimination of racism, elimination of prejudice of any kind.
Mhm.
And actually, when Abdul Baha came to the United States, he was a central figure of Baha'i faith, came to the United States in 1912. He suggested a Black gentleman who was a lawyer at the time, and he respected him so much, to marry a white lady, for example. In our religion, a lot of interracial marriages is happening because of that. I can say that is almost the racism in our in our faith, in our society is gone. We don't have that. We understand and we respect each other, and there is no. So those are things that should be done a little bit more, and I don't know what is being done, especially about the education incorporated in the schools. This issue. And my question is that I always wonder if the racism in this country is this and polarization in this country, is it more than other countries? Is this the most polarization in the United States, or do you know about that?
I don't know the answer to that. What I can say is that our racial history is grounded in an economic history, and that is the economic trajectory of the United States is bound up with the wholesale enslavement of African people and African descended people. It's because of that forced and free labor over several centuries that the United States of America has a presence on the global economic stage that would not have otherwise been possible. So the invention of racial categories really is very much related to the need in the 17th and 18th centuries to identify a workforce. And race was then used as the basis to do that. And so the economic reality of race and the social reality of race are so deeply intertwined in American history that I think just now some of the best research on that is beginning to emerge. One of the books that addresses specifically the relationship between this country's economic history and its racial history is a book by Edward Baptist. The title is The Half Has Not Been Told. And what Edward Baptist does is really look at the financial institutions in the United States and how they were and how they prospered as a direct result of the institution of slavery. That is not something that appears in history books. And to your point, the more knowledge there is, the better. I think there has been an assumption that the United States has pulled itself up by its own goodness and bootstraps, when in reality, if you look at the economic impact of slavery, we cannot walk away from the fact that there is that relationship in this country. Now, I cannot say if that is completely unique to the United States. There has been colonization, many types of colonization in other places, and there might be parallels. I only know that certainly in the United States, there is that reality where the economic well-being of the country has, to a great degree, been on the backs of people who were enslaved.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have another question coming in, or comment from Dr. Jessica Crump, one of our residents.
Hi, Dr. Reed. I'm Dr. Cheska Crump, one of the third years. And first, thank you so much for coming to talk to us about a very important issue that me and my peers have really always wanted to really talk about, but just kind of sometimes, where do you start to have that conversation? But I wanted to make a comment about your book that I read, as well as ask a question. And kind of my comment is, you know, the title of the book is, you know, you're likely not a racist. And, you know, while reading it, of course, I was definitely kind of re-experiencing my own trauma as far as race, looking at a lot of those examples and, you know, looking back where I was during that. And I kind of got another sense of, you know, you're likely not a racist as far as the noun, but you definitely can do and say racist things that can be just as harmful. You can say racist jokes. You can promote racist policies and laws, you know, things of that nature. And it would, if you are going to say you're for social justice and for equality and for equity, it would be in your best interest. And so we can heal, you know, be curious and ask those questions and to educate yourself. So I definitely wanted to make that comment because in my experience in circles kind of explaining this, I get the comment, oh, I'm not a racist, you know, as in, you know, Ku Klux Klan type of definition of racist, or, you know, sorry if I offended anybody, Donald Trump, you know, type of racist. But, you know, doing those racist things, which are just examples, which I've mentioned, can be just as harmful in the long run. So I'm happy that we're having more talks about that. And kind of my question is, I appreciate you in the beginning talking about your own experiences with your introduction to whiteness as, you know, a young child and, you know, growing up and as you went on through your education and through your career. And I just wanted to know, you know, besides, you know, the friends that you mentioned, what were some other situations where you approached someone who was like, I'm not a racist, but kind of doing and saying racist things that are offensive and harmful? How did you kind of call them out on what they were doing, but at the same time, educate them, you know, in a way that, you know, there can be that learning and that empathy? You know?
Oh, thank you very much for that question. And I have numerous examples of that. One that comes to mind right away is from my college years in Valparaiso. I only put a small portion of my Valparaiso experience in the book, but I could write another book just about just about Valparaiso. I was a music major as an undergraduate, and a music major spent a lot of time in practice rooms. And so I was the only, as I mentioned in the book, only African-American in my entering freshman class, and just met with a tsunami of whiteness and assumptions that were a complete surprise to me, but felt that I had found a cohort of colleagues and peers in the small group of people who were music majors. There was one particular classmate who I, in the practice room, sort of in passing, I overheard her talk about Latinx people in very, very disparaging terms, using the kinds of inflammatory language that would certainly cringeworthy, saying things like, you know, wetbacks, and she was talking very freely about people of color who happen to be of Latinx descent, and in my presence, and I could not help but to feel that the freedom with which she was talking about another group of people of color was very likely the freedom with which she may have expressed some opinions about other people of color, myself included. And we'd been in classes together. And I think by this time we were probably juniors. It was a small department, so we took most of our classes together, and we were friendly competitors, but cordial. But I was really offended that she felt it was okay to use those descriptors and use that language about Hispanic people. And so I pulled her aside, and I said, "Did you just say?" And then I repeated what she said. And she said, yes, but what I meant was, and I said, what you said was. And I then confronted her about the freedom with which she expressed those opinions. And I just asked her point blank, do you feel that way about me? And that was an awkward moment. That was an awkward moment for her. It wasn't awkward for me, but it was awkward for her because she was forced to reflect upon the implications of having that conversation about race. It didn't matter that she wasn't talking about Black people in that moment, but it was an example of a freedom and a privilege that she felt to characterize people in a way that clearly expressed her view that they were inferior. Did we have more conversations after that? We certainly did, but those kinds of conversations were ones in which she was very, very careful. At least she was aware. I don't know if that changed her opinion. Maybe it didn't, but it did change her awareness, at least in my presence, that there can be remarks that are hurtful. And I don't know that she would have described herself as a racist. Most people don't. And most people, here's the other part, and here's the reason that I chose this title for the book. Most people, even if they are textbook racist, most people don't want to claim that and own that. Most people want to believe that they are good people who are on the side of good, and that they're just trying to make their way through life the best way they can, the way that they were taught, and that the people who raised them taught them they should do. Ethics are very interesting because there can be someone who was raised in a completely racist household who is taught a view of right and wrong that is in that framework. And if that kid grows up in that household with no other frame of reference, it is highly ethical for them, from their perspective, to repeat the patterns of the people that they respect. They don't know anything else. They don't know anything to compare it to. And so from that view, it's a tough nut to crack for an opposing perspective to challenge that. Now, here's what's not going to happen. If you start out with, you're a racist, people clam up. They become defensive. They shut down. And then we get nowhere. So there's a lot of literature out there that does that. Lots of books that start out with the accusation. Let's set the groundwork. Let's just make it, let's just clarify out the gate that you're a racist. Well, what does that do? What that does is make people less open to having conversations. So knowing full well that many Black people will find the title offensive until they read the book, I intentionally chose that title, You're Likely Not a Racist, because I want to move the needle. I want to facilitate conversation. I want to break down defense rather than reinforce it. And at the end of the day, I am writing to curious white people. I'm not writing to Black people. I know that experience. I'm writing to white people who need to have a different experience. So you're absolutely right. There are folks who do some racist things. We all have the capacity to do that. And Ibram Kendi, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, does an excellent job of describing how we all have the capacity to move in and out of spaces that are racist because we're human beings. But when we think about the many connotations of that term and the reactions that it draws from people who usually get the accusation, what is the objective? The outcome that I would seek is that people who don't know what they need to know start to learn what they need to know. And you can't do that by creating defensiveness among people who already are, by virtue of the way they're packaged, they're already going to get that accusation. I think it's time for a different message and a different openness by holding out possibility that maybe that's not where we begin. Maybe where we begin is by honoring that there is curiosity. Curiosity is good. Knowledge to satisfy curiosity is even better. And if we have to have an uncomfortable title to a book to get us there, then I'm willing to take that step.
Thank you so much for that answer. And thank you for, adding, giving more explanation on why you chose those titles and, even the titles of the chapters to kind of spark that conversation and get people to read the book and educate themselves. I just noticed there's also a very interesting question in the Q&A from Dr. Abbas, if you could. But thank you so much for answering my question.
We're gonna
Thank you
get to
very
that one. I've got Dr. Shane Bachler up next.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Reed, thank you for giving this talk. And I actually have a question for you that was specifically because of your role as a music professor. You know, music obviously is a art form that's a communal shared experience a lot of times with concerts and whatnot. And, you know, you had discussed earlier, and I thought it was, you know, Dr. Elza's comment was interesting as well about the use of the N-word and who speaks it.
Yeah.
Well, when it's used in lyrics, that kind of muddies the waters some. I've got a 20-year-old son who listens to hip hop. And I guess my question is, am I correct when I have warned him that since he is not of the African-American culture, he should not be singing along with those lyrics?
I actually talk about that very thing in the book. So yes, I have an answer for you. One of the things we have to recognize about the current generation is that their reality is their cultural landscape is so different than what would have been normal for us at their age 25, 30, 40 years ago. They are very detached from the historical connotations of those terms. And I promise you that most folks born since, born since the year 2000, most young people who are singing along with those lyrics, for them, those terms are completely deracialized. They do not have the framework or the context that someone my age would have. And so that's the first thing to recognize. One of the things that I talk about in the book is exactly a very parallel experience where my young nephew brought home his girlfriend of the month, as 17-year-olds do. And she was a lovely white girl who was maybe the same age, 16 or 17 years old, came to our family home. And she very jokingly, in all innocence, referred to him as my N-word. Of course, the whole family grows cold because we are, again, that word takes its meaning for us, for people of a certain age, takes its meaning from who utters it. And so she was genuinely confused as to why her utterance of that word changed the temperature of the family and her presence in the home. So I took her aside, lovely young lady that she was. I asked her that if we could go for a walk. And I took her outside away from the family. And I very, very gently explained to her what had just happened. And I told her that that word is a very heavy word with a lot of history and with a lot of pain and with a lot of with deep layers of meaning, especially if it comes from someone who is white. And I acknowledged to her that I know that you hear this word all the time, but I want you to understand that when you come into a Black home where there are aunts and uncles and grandparents, and you say that word as a young white woman, I want you to understand what you have just done. And she was very sweet and very receptive. She understood. And she was, quite frankly, pretty embarrassed, and she cried. But I gave her a big hug. And I told her that it was good that we had that talk, and we went back inside and we had a nice dinner and life went on. So there are those teaching moments. I don't think that you can simply tell young people, don't say that. That's not good enough for them. They need an explanation. And that gets back to this whole business of understanding that it takes time to create context and to flesh out in a full and purposeful way why things are the way they are. We are against the tide of a generation that is used to quick answers that you can get in 2 seconds. And this is not that. This has to be deeper and more intentional and more caring and more loving and more thorough than that. And I believe that this young woman and I got somewhere. after we had that conversation. So I think it is important always when there are teaching moments, I think it's important to teach, but it's impossible to teach without understanding who you're teaching. If we teach young people as though they are us, we'll miss every time. We have to teach them as though they are them. And we have to recognize that their frame of reference is so incredibly different, and that their attention spans have been conditioned so differently than ours. And we have to, start out by acknowledging that I know that you are not intentionally doing or saying a bad thing, but here are the layers behind that. Here are the roots behind that. This is what this means to a lot of people who are your parents and grandparents' ages. And there have been a few times when I've had those opportunities to have those teaching moments, I've invariably found young people to be receptive and they get it, but I can't have that experience with them if I don't start out by respecting where they are.
Thank you. And I think we have one question in the Q&A that hasn't been addressed. So Dr. Abbas asked or says, I really enjoyed your book. Can you talk more about your experiences living in Gary, Indiana?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you who've read my book. I deeply appreciate it. Gary, Indiana, I was born and raised there. I was born in 1964. And so all of my formative experiences were in Gary, Indiana. I was there until I went away to college. And at the time that I was there, it was a vibrant and bustling and colorful and fun and creative and prosperous city. Of course, the industrial backbone of Gary, Indiana, were the steel mills. And the steel mills were the draw for many African-American people who had begun life, descended from enslaved people in the South, who then made their livings in sharecropping. And it was, there were three important periods of migration where many African-American people, including my ancestors, decided to leave the South and to go to the industrial North to get away from sharecropping and Jim Crow racism and find a better life. And so my ancestors were ones who migrated out of the South and were drawn to Gary because you could get a job in the steel mill and you could have a good living and you could raise your family and educate your children. So that was the industrial basis of Gary. And it was really until about the mid 80s that that industry was bode well for Gary and made it a prosperous and wonderful city to be. But there were a couple of circumstances that began to change Gary. One was the election of the first Black mayor, I believe in 1968, created white flight. And much of the tax base began to move to the suburbs and out of the city. And we all know what happens with urban decay. And the second thing that happened coupled with that was the decline of the steel industry. The steel industry went largely overseas. And so many of the people who had been originally attracted to Gary, many of them African-Americans who came from a Southern sharecropping background, as did both sets of my grandparents. Those people that could get good jobs up until the late 1970s, that all changed pretty quickly in the mid to late 80s and 90s and afterward. And so the poverty and the crime that you hear about now associated with Gary, that's a phenomenon related to those social and economic changes. But I always say that if I had the choice to grow up anywhere in the world, I would choose to grow up where I did in Gary, because I certainly got an excellent foundation. I think I got a first-rate public education. I went to Gary Westside High School, and as did my parents were educated in public schools in Northwest Indiana. And I don't think I could have had a better experience. And it's a city that I still love, and I have hope for it.
So thank you for spending time with us this afternoon, Dr. Reed, and thank you to the attendees for your questions and comments. And in the interest of keeping everybody on time, I think we'll wrap up. But again, if you haven't had a chance to see the book or pick up the book, it's not too late. It's still out there. It's on Amazon. and I highly recommend. So have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.